The Jedi were supposed to be the guardians of peace, the wise scholars of the Force, the noble defenders of the Republic. But when the Clone Wars started, they became something else entirely. They became generals, leaders of massive armies, commanders of soldiers who lived and died by their orders. And while we've seen the stories of Jedi like Anakin, Obi-Wan, and Yoda, their leadership is not what I want to focus on. Because the truth is, they were not the only ones leading troops into battle. Across the galaxy, Jedi Knights and Masters were put in charge of entire battalions. Names we barely hear. Jedi we don't spend much time with. They were given authority over legions of clones, expected to be both warriors and strategists, expected to make life or death decisions with little more than their instincts and a lightsaber. But most of these Jedi were not prepared for war. They were not trained for it. They had spent their lives studying the Force, meditating in temples, keeping the peace in small disputes. And suddenly, they were leading armies into galactic warfare. Think about Jedi, like Ki-Adi-Mundi, who sent his troops charging into battle without considering the cost. Or Pong Krell, who saw the clones as nothing more than pawns, throwing them into fights without a second thought. Or Aayla Secura, who, despite being respected, still followed orders without questioning the bigger picture. These were the Jedi leading the Republic's forces. These were the generals making the choices that shaped the war, and many of those choices were disastrous. It's easy to look at the Clone Wars and see the Jedi as heroes. After all, they were fighting against the Separatists. They were fighting against the Sith, but that does not mean they were good at leading an army. That does not mean they understood war. Because the truth is, the Jedi were out of their depth. They made mistakes that cost lives. They walked into traps they should have seen coming. They treated the war like something they could win through sheer willpower, when in reality, they were already doomed from the start. In this video, I want to talk about those Jedi, the ones we don't see as much. The ones who made the decisions that shaped the war behind the scenes. Because when you really look at how they led, when you really break down the way they commanded their troops, it becomes painfully clear. The Jedi were horrible generals. The Jedi were peacekeepers, not soldiers. They trained for diplomacy, not for battle strategy. They spent their lives meditating in temples, not leading troops into war zones. And yet the Republic threw them into war like they were born for it. Suddenly they were leading entire legions of clone troopers into battle. They were giving orders, making life and death decisions like seasoned war commanders. But they had no real experience in military leadership. They had no proper training, no long history of strategic warfare. What did they think was going to happen? That the Jedi would somehow just figure it out? That their instincts alone would be enough? War does not work like that. War is won by preparation, by tactical experience, by years of studying the enemy. The Jedi had none of that. They relied on the Force. They relied on their code. They believed their sense of righteousness would guide them. But righteousness does not win battles. Discipline does. They walked into the Clone Wars blindfolded, thinking their ideals would be enough. It was not. The Jedi did not understand war. They treated every battle like it was some kind of test, like it was another Jedi trial they had to pass. But this was not a test. This was real. Real soldiers, real enemies, real consequences. They fought with the same philosophy they used in duels. They rushed in with their lightsabers blazing. They trusted their own skill over strategy. They charged headfirst into enemy fire, thinking their reflexes alone would protect them. But war is not about individual skill. War is about coordination, precision, and planning. The Jedi ignored that, and their troops paid the price. How many clones died because of their reckless decisions? How many times did they order their troops into unwinnable fights? They saw themselves as noble warriors, but the clones saw the truth. The Jedi were gambling with their lives. They were throwing them into the fire over and over again, and the worst part, they barely acknowledged it. They barely reflected on their failures. They moved from battle to battle without realizing they were making the same mistakes again and again, because they did not think like soldiers. They thought like Jedi, and that was a problem. The Jedi preached about respect, about treating others with dignity. But when it came to the clones, they acted like they were expendable, like their lives mattered less. They said they valued them, but their actions said otherwise. Clones were not droids. They had names, personalities, emotions. They were real people, yet the Jedi called them by numbers. They saw them as soldiers first, and individuals second. They never truly accepted them as equals. The clones knew it, they felt it, and they resented it. The Jedi rarely asked what the clones thought. They rarely listened to their concerns. They gave orders expecting blind obedience. They assumed the clones would follow without hesitation. But how could they not see the problem with that? How could they not understand that loyalty is earned, not demanded? The clones were fighting a war they had no choice in. A war that was never theirs to begin with. And the Jedi did nothing to change that. They led them into battle, but they never led them to freedom. They fought beside them, but they never fought for them. And that is something they will always be guilty of. The Jedi believed they knew the Sith. They thought they understood their ways. But they did not see how much the Sith had evolved, how much they had adapted. The Sith were not just warriors. They were strategists. They were manipulators. And the Jedi never caught up. Palpatine played them like fools. He dangled the Clone Wars in front of them, and they took the bait. He turned them into soldiers when they were supposed to be guardians. He made them the face of war, knowing it would ruin them. And they never saw it coming. They were so focused on fighting the war that they never asked why it was happening in the first place. They never stopped to consider that the entire thing was a setup. They trusted the Senate. They trusted the Republic. But most of all, they trusted themselves. And that was their greatest mistake. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. The war had consumed them. The Jedi Order was broken. Their enemies had already won. Because this was never about winning battles. This was about destroying the Jedi from the inside out. And the Sith did exactly that. Jedi were taught to control their emotions, to think clearly and act rationally. But war is chaos. War is bloodshed. It does not leave room for peace of mind. It forces you to feel, to react, to change. And the Jedi could not handle that. They let anger slip through in battle. They let frustration get the best of them. They became attached to their troops, to their allies, to the war itself. They were supposed to be above attachment, but how could they be? They were fighting side by side with men who were dying for them every day. They became more aggressive, more ruthless. They made choices that went against their code. They justified actions they never would have accepted before. They told themselves it was necessary, that it was the only way. But deep down they knew they were losing themselves. By the end of the war, the Jedi were not the same order they once were. They had changed, and not for the better. They were warriors now, not peacekeepers, and they could never go back to what they were before. The Jedi believed in the Republic. They fought for it without question, but they never realized how corrupt it had become, how much it had already fallen apart. They were defending a broken system, and they never stopped to ask if it was even worth saving. They thought they were protecting democracy, but they were being used. The Senate did not care about them. The Republic did not care about them. They were nothing more than tools, pawns in a game they never even knew they were playing. They should have walked away. They should have seen the truth. But they did not. They clung to their ideals. They convinced themselves they were doing the right thing, even as the Republic crumbled around them, even as it turned into the very thing they claimed to stand against. By the time they tried to resist, it was already over. The Republic became the Empire, and the Jedi were nothing but relics of a past that no longer mattered. They thought they would survive, that they would always be there to guide the galaxy, but they were blind to their own weaknesses. They never saw how fragile they really were. They ignored the warnings. They dismissed the signs. They thought the Sith were gone for good, but they had never left. They had been watching, planning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when Order 66 came, they had no defense. Nothing. They were wiped out in days. Their great temples burned. Their proud order reduced to whispers and legends. Because they were not warriors, they were not leaders, and in the end they were not even survivors. They were just another casualty of the Clone Wars. A lesson in what happens when you try. A war you were never meant to fight. This war was never theirs to lead. It was never theirs to win. They stepped into a role they did not understand, and they paid the price for it. They believed they were doing what was right, but they were fighting a war they should have never been a part of. They lost themselves in the chaos. They lost their purpose. And eventually they lost everything. The Jedi were great warriors, but they were horrible generals. They were never meant to command armies. They were never meant to be soldiers. And when they tried to be, it led to their downfall. Maybe they could have changed things. Maybe they could have seen the truth. But they did not. And that is why the Jedi are gone. That is why they fell. And that is why they will never rise again. Thanks so much for watching. I spend a good bit of time making sure each video is great. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. It really helps out and means a lot to me. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'll see you in the next one.